There is a moment recorded by Roman historians that remains 2,000 years later, one of the most disturbing scenes ever documented within the walls of the capital of the world. A man is found hiding behind a curtain in the imperial palace. He is trembling. He is weeping. He believes he is about to die. And the soldiers who find him, the same men who have just assassinated the emperor, drop to their knees before him and proclaim him the absolute sovereign of Rome. He was not a general. He was not a senator. He was a man who had spent his entire life being ignored, underestimated, and kept at a deliberate distance from power precisely because he seemed incapable of exercising it. And he would become emperor because a group of soldiers decided it would be so, because a group of soldiers had just discovered, or more precisely, had just confirmed, that they were the ones who truly governed Rome. This scene is not an anomaly. It is a pattern. It is the internal logic of an institution that Augustus created to protect imperial power, and that, over 3 centuries, transformed itself into the greatest threat any Roman emperor ever faced, not on the banks of the Rhine, not on the steppes of Parthia, not in the deserts of Numidia, but inside the palace itself, in the corridor beside the bedchamber, behind the curtain where a man trembled and waited to die. This is the history of the Praetorian Guard, of the instrument that became more dangerous than any enemy it was created to fight. In 27 BC, Octavian Augustus concluded the transformation that had converted the Roman Republic into an empire. The civil war was over. Mark Antony was dead. Cleopatra was dead. And Octavian, now Augustus, the title meaning the revered, the sacred, above common men, was the only man who mattered in the Mediterranean world. But Augustus understood something that many of his successors would forget. Absolute power creates absolute enemies. Julius Caesar had died by trusting the Senate too much. 23 stab wounds on the 15th of March, 44 BC, at the base of Pompey's statue, delivered by men he had considered friends and collaborators. Augustus would not make the same mistake. The solution was the creation of the cohortes praetoriae, the Praetorian cohorts, in 27 BC. The idea was not new. During the Republic, generals on campaign maintained an elite personal guard called a cohors praetoria, deriving its name from the command tent, the praetorium. What Augustus did was different. He institutionalized this guard as a permanent body, linked directly to the person of the emperor, funded by the imperial treasury, and existing in peace as in war. The initial structure comprised 9 cohorts, each of approximately 500 men. A number later expanded to 1,000 per cohort. 3 cohorts were stationed in Rome. The remaining 6 were distributed across the cities of Italy, Ostia, Puteoli, Praeneste, far enough from the center to avoid the appearance of a military occupation of the capital, close enough to respond within hours if necessary. Recruitment was selective. While the provincial legions accepted recruits from across the empire, the Praetorian Guard drew primarily from central Italy, Etruria, Umbria, Latium, men who spoke Latin without a provincial accent, who came from families with a military tradition, who carried in their bearing and their names the mark of Rome. The preference was deliberate. Augustus wanted guardsmen who were culturally Roman, not merely legally so. Pay reflected this exceptional status. A common legionary received under Augustus approximately 900 sesterces per year. A praetorian received between 1,500 and 1,800, nearly double, with access to donativa, the additional cash distributions the emperor offered on special occasions, imperial accessions, military victories, or simply to guarantee loyalty at moments of instability. Augustus, in his will, left 250 denarii to each ordinary legionary and 500 to each praetorian. The difference was unambiguous. The guard was worth more because it protected more. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century of the Common Era, described the guard as the silent pillar upon which imperial authority rested. They were not visible in the great military parades. They did not march in imposing formations through the provinces. They operated close in. They operated within. During the first years, the system worked. Augustus governed for 41 years, dying in AD 14 of natural causes. a rarity that would become increasingly uncommon for his successors. The Guard had fulfilled its primary function, deterrence through proximity. But two factors were already beginning to alter the balance of power in ways even Augustus had not anticipated. The first was geographic. In AD 23, during the reign of Tiberius, the Praetorian prefect Lucius Aelius Sejanus convinced the emperor to construct a permanent base for the entire Guard within Rome. The result was the Castra Praetoria, a rectangular fortress erected just outside the Servian wall, measuring 440 meters in length by 380 in width, with solid masonry walls, stone gates, and capacity to house thousands of armed soldiers less than an hour's march from the Senate, the Forum, and the Imperial Palace. Until that moment, the geographic dispersal of the cohorts had functioned as a natural limiter of Praetorian power. 1/3 in Rome, 2/3 in other cities. Concentrating them all in a single fortress within the capital was a decision that Tacitus, the Roman historian whose annales constitute the primary source for this period, described with vocabulary unusual for a Roman annalist. He called it a miscalculation, whose consequences would be felt for generations. The second factor was personal. Sejanus, the man who had orchestrated this concentration, was not merely a military commander. He was, in practice, the most powerful man in Rome during the final decade of Tiberius's reign. With the emperor withdrawn to the island of Capri, where Tiberius spent his final years of rule in partial self-exile, distant from the intrigues of the capital, Sejanus exercised functions that overlapped with those of a co-emperor. He controlled access to the sovereign. He controlled the flow of information. He controlled the Guard. Tiberius called him Socius Laborum, companion in toil. It was a precise description, and at the same time a dangerously imprecise one. What Sejanus built in those years was something for which Rome still had no name, because the institution he was creating was new, a state within the state, operating through the Guard but not limited by it. In AD 31, Tiberius discovered, or was informed by sources whose identity historians still debate, that Sejanus was planning to depose him. The response was equally elegant in its brutality. A letter to the Senate, read during a session at which Sejanus was present, that opened with praise for the prefect and transformed, paragraph by paragraph, into an indictment. By the end of the reading, Sejanus was dead, executed on the same day. But the model Sejanus had established, the Praetorian prefect as de facto power behind the throne, survived him, because the model was not personal, it was structural. This is where the script of Roman history began to repeat itself in variations of escalating extremity. In AD 41, 4 years after the death of Tiberius, the Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known to posterity by his childhood nickname Caligula, a diminutive of Caligae, the military sandals he wore as a child in his father's camps, had exhausted the patience of the very Guard that had acclaimed him emperor. The available historical records, principally the lives of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius and the Roman history of Cassius Dio, describe an emperor who treated his Praetorians with calculated contempt, who humiliated them publicly, who forced them to execute orders designed to shame them as much as to be obeyed. 2 Guard officers, Cassius Chaerea and Cornelius Sabinus, led a conspiracy that included senators, freedmen, and members of the court. On January 24, AD 41, during the Palatine Games, Gaius Caligula was separated from his entourage in a corridor of the palace complex. What the historians recorded was systematic, not an attack, but an execution. 23 stab wounds, the same number that had ended the life of Julius Caesar, a detail that educated Romans would certainly have noticed. Afterward, the Praetorians found the Empress Caesonia and killed her too, and the couple's young daughter, Julia Drusilla. The Senate, convened in emergency session, debated the possibility of restoring the Republic. It was a discussion that lasted hours, and it was interrupted by a fait accompli. While the senators deliberated, soldiers of the Guard had found Caligula's uncle, Tiberius Claudius Caesar, a 50-year-old man with a speech impediment, a slight limp and a reputation of near-total political irrelevance, hiding behind a curtain in the palace chambers. The Praetorians did not request the Senate's authorization. They did not consult Caligula's testament. They simply carried Claudius to the Castra Praetoria and acclaimed him emperor. When the Senate was informed of what had occurred, there was no alternative. Rome's only armed force had made its decision. Claudius paid each Praetorian a donativum of 15 sesterces, according to other sources, 750 denarii, the equivalent of multiple years of salary for a common legionary. It was the price of a throne, and it established a precedent no subsequent emperor could afford to ignore. The modern historian Guy de la Bédoyère, in analysis extensively cited by contemporary historiography, summarized the structural consequence of that moment with precision. Augustus had created, possibly without fully understanding it, the most dangerous institution the Roman world had ever seen. It was not loyalty that the Praetorian Guard was selling, it was contingency. Nero, who governed from AD 54 to 68, received from the Guard the same donativum of 750 denarii per soldier that had been paid by Claudius at the moment of his accession. The pattern was fixed. Each new emperor purchased his security with an immediate cash distribution. Failing to do so was politically suicidal. Galba, who succeeded Nero after the latter's suicide in AD 68, committed exactly that error. The Praetorian prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, had promised the Guard, in Galba's name, a donativum of 7,500 denarii per soldier, double what had been paid to Claudius and Nero. It was a promise Nymphidius made without Galba's authorization. When the new emperor arrived in Rome and refused to pay, declaring, according to Plutarch, that it was his custom to levy soldiers, not to buy them, the result was predictable within the logic the institution itself had established. On January 15th, AD 69, 7 months after assuming the throne, Galba was assassinated in the Roman Forum. His successor, Marcus Otho, had been the primary conspirator against him. He was a Roman patrician who had promised the payment Galba had refused. The Guard, consistent with its own transactional logic, supported him. The year AD 69 would become known in historiography as the Year of the Four Emperors: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, each governing for periods ranging from weeks to months, each transition marked by violence, betrayal, and the central role of armed forces. Not only the Praetorians, but the provincial legions which, for the first time in a systematic way, understood that power resided in armies, not merely in the Senate or the capital. Tacitus himself, in his Historia, articulated the lesson that year taught the empire. The secret of power had been revealed. It was possible to create an emperor somewhere other than Rome. The provincial legions, which had never received accession donativa, which fought on the frontiers while the Praetorians slept in beds inside a fortress in the capital, were arriving at the same conclusion the Guard had reached decades before. Armed force decides. But it was in AD 193 that the Praetorian logic reached its most naked, most brutal, and, in historical retrospect, its most revealing expression of fundamental nature. The year began with the assassination of Emperor Commodus on the night of December 31st, 192, strangled by an athlete named Narcissus. The crime had been organized by his concubine Marcia and by the Praetorian prefect himself, Aemilius Laetus, who had concluded that Commodus was planning to eliminate them. The following day, January 1st, 193, the Senate proclaimed emperor the city prefect Publius Helvius Pertinax, a 66-year-old man with a reputation for discipline, frugality, and administrative rigor. These were precisely the qualities that would condemn him. Pertinax attempted to restore discipline within the Praetorian Guard. He reduced privileges, he imposed rules, he refused to pay the donativum values the soldiers expected. The accounts of Herodian and Cassius Dio describe a growing tension in the first weeks of his reign, soldiers murmuring in the corridors of the Castra Praetoria, tribunes privately contesting orders they publicly obeyed. On March 28, AD 193, 87 days after assuming the throne, a faction of approximately 300 soldiers invaded the imperial palace. The accounts diverge on the details of what followed, but converge on the essentials. Pertinax went to them. He tried to speak. One soldier threw a spear. Others followed. the emperor fell. What happened in the hours that followed is the episode that defines, more than any other, what the Praetorian Guard had become. The soldiers returned to the Castra Praetoria, and there, from the walls of their own fortress, they announced that the Roman throne was for sale. This was not metaphor. It was literally an auction. Two men competed. Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, father-in-law of the assassinated emperor, prefect of the city of Rome, who was already inside the camp attempting to negotiate, offered 20 Maunzaran sesterces per soldier. It was 8 times the annual salary of a legionary. It was a figure that would have seemed impossible just years before. But Marcus Didius Julianus, a wealthy 60-year-old senator who had arrived at the scene after being warned by his family that there was an opportunity, outbid him. 25 zero sesterces per soldier. In some accounts, the two men made signals up and down, like bidders at a market, while the soldiers watched and calculated. The guard chose Didius Julianus. Cassius Dio was present in Rome that day. He describes the scene with vocabulary that is not that of a detached analyst, but of a disturbed witness. Rome had been auctioned like a property. The Senate, informed of the events, proclaimed Didius Julianus emperor because there was no alternative. The capital's only armed force had decided. Didius Julianus governed 66 days. Because the Praetorian logic had a structural flaw that its own success had created, by openly demonstrating that the throne could be purchased, the Praetorians had signaled to the commanders of the provincial legions that the system was open for negotiation. 3 of them responded simultaneously: Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Lucius Septimius Severus in Pannonia. Severus moved fastest. Proclaimed emperor by his troops on April 9, 193, he marched from Carnuntum, the legionary fortress on the banks of the Danube in what is today Austria, toward Rome, with a speed that historical records describe as surprising for a troop movement of that scale. What happened as Severus approached Rome revealed the final dimension of the Praetorian contradiction. The soldiers who had placed Didius Julianus on the throne refused to fight to defend him. The Senate, sensing the shifting forces, condemned Didius to death. On June 1, 193, an officer dispatched to the palace executed the emperor, who had lasted less than 10 weeks. Severus entered Rome as a conqueror, and he did something no emperor had done before with the Guard. He dissolved it completely. He sent the Praetorian soldiers disarmed out of Rome, with orders never to return within 160 stadia, approximately 30 kilometers, of the capital, on pain of death. He replaced it with troops recruited from his own Danubian legions. It was a solution that resolved the immediate problem, but Severus recreated an imperial guard with the same structure, the same privileges, the same transactional logic, because any emperor who came to power perceived that he needed a guard. And any guard powerful enough to protect him would be, by the same logic, powerful enough to threaten him. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. The next video in this series goes even deeper into the forces that shaped and destroyed the ancient world, and you won't want to miss it. The 3rd century of the Common Era would become known in historiography as the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of 50 years, from AD 235 to 284, during which the Roman Empire experienced an instability that bordered on dissolution. In 5 decades, Rome had more than 50 emperors. The majority died violently. The Praetorian Guard was involved in a significant number of those deaths. What had changed was not merely the frequency of the violence, it was the logic governing it. During the Julio-Claudian period, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, the Praetorians killed for motivations that could be, at least partially, analyzed in terms of factional politics, conspiracies, personal alignments, political fear. During the 3rd century, the Guard killed by a simpler mechanism. The emperor who did not pay enough was replaced by one who promised to pay more. It was not cruelty. It was arithmetic, and it was arithmetic the system had been teaching the Guard for generations. Each accession donativum confirmed the lesson. Loyalty has a price. Each assassination without consequences for the assassins confirmed the corollary. The absence of payment has a cost. The German historian Alexander de Mant in his analysis of Roman decline, identified the incentive structure created by the Praetorian Guard as one of the systemic factors that accelerated the erosion of imperial authority in the 3rd century. Not because the Praetorians were exceptionally corrupt by Roman standards, but because the system created to concentrate protection had concentrated, inevitably, power. There was one man, however, who observed this pattern with a clarity his predecessors had not possessed, or had not survived long enough to act upon. Flavius Valerius Constantinus, the man posterity would call Constantine the Great, came to power in circumstances that mirrored, with variations, the Praetorian cycles of previous generations. His father, Constantius I, had been co-emperor of the West until his death in 306. Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops in York in Britain shortly after, but the legitimacy of his proclamation was contested. The system of government of the empire, the tetrarchy created by Diocletian, did not recognize the dynastic succession principle Constantine was invoking. The rival Constantine would face in Rome was Maxentius, son of the former Emperor Maximian, who controlled Italy and Africa and whose power rested, among other forces, upon the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorians had supported Maxentius since the beginning of his rule in 306. It was a natural alliance within the logic that had governed the institution for 3 centuries, the candidate who controlled Rome and could pay. On October 28, AD 3-12, on the banks of the Tiber, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge decided the fate of the Roman West. The armies of Constantine and Maxentius met north of Rome. Maxentius's forces included the Praetorians. Maxentius died during the fighting, drowned in the Tiber while attempting to retreat, according to the accounts of Eusebius of Caesarea and Lactantius, and Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed ruler of the West. What he did in the following weeks was surgical. The Praetorian Guard was dissolved, not reorganized, not reformed, not replaced by a body of the same name with different members, dissolved. The surviving soldiers were dispersed individually to frontier garrisons on the Rhine and the Danube, not as a unit, not as a cohort, but as individuals, without collective identity, without the Castra Praetoria that had been the physical heart of their power for almost 300 years. The fortress itself was partially demolished. According to the historian Zosimus and available archaeological records, the south and west walls of the Castra Praetoria were destroyed. The north and east walls had been incorporated into the Aurelian walls and remained standing as part of the city's defenses, but the fortress as an operational entity was annihilated. The archaeological remains can still be found today in the northeast of Rome, incorporated into the modern urban fabric. Constantine transferred the imperial capital to Byzantium, renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine, in the year 330. It was a decision carrying multiple meanings: administrative, strategic, and for anyone who knew the history of the preceding 3 centuries, profoundly symbolic. The new center of imperial power would be more than 400 kilometers from the ruins, where the Guard had transformed assassination into an instrument of state. The Praetorian Guard existed for exactly 339 years, from 27 BC to AD 312. In that period, it was involved in the assassination or deposition of at least 15 emperors, depending on the criteria used to count direct versus indirect participation. It auctioned the Roman throne once, in an event with irrefutable documentary record. It proclaimed emperors at least half a dozen times without consulting the Senate. It transformed the accession donativum, originally a gesture of imperial generosity, into an implicit tariff that any pretender to power was required to pay. The paradox Augustus had not anticipated was structural, not personal. He had created a force sufficiently powerful to protect the emperor from all external enemies, but he had not created, and it was perhaps impossible to create within the political logic of Rome, a mechanism to protect the emperor from the very force that protected him. Any guard close enough to intervene between the sovereign and danger is, by that same proximity, in a position to be the danger. The problem was not the corruption of any specific individual. It was the geometry of power. Modern historians still debate whether Augustus could have foreseen what he created. Brian Campbell, in his analysis of the Imperial Roman army, argues that Augustus's decision was rationally justified within the parameters of the world he knew. The civil war had ended. The armies needed to be concentrated and loyal, and a personal guard was an obvious solution to the problem of personal security. Guy de la Bédoyère, on the other hand, identifies in the very institutional mechanisms Augustus established, the concentration, the differential pay, the privileged access, the inevitable ingredients of what would follow. Both are correct within their own premises. What the history of the Praetorian Guard demonstrates is that institutions do not fail because their creators were naive. They fail because power, once concentrated, develops its own logic. And that logic, the simple arithmetic that whoever controls the armed force controls the succession, is older than Rome and more durable than any constitutional arrangement men can conceive to contain it. The man Constantine destroyed in 312 was not the specific Praetorian Guard that had existed under Commodus or under Caligula. It was the principle that Guard had embodied for 3 centuries, the idea that loyalty is a commodity, that the throne has a price, and that the armed men closest to the sovereign are, in the end, more powerful than the sovereign they were hired to defend. That principle survived the demolition of the Castra Praetoria. It reappeared in Byzantium, in the Palace of Constantinople, where the Varangians, the Varangian Guard of the medieval emperors of the East, reproduced, in different uniforms and different language, the same logic of proximity and power. It reappeared in the Ottoman Janissaries, in the Mamluks of Egypt, in the Swiss Guard, in every power structure that needed armed men trustworthy enough to protect the sovereign. The conclusion. The history of the Praetorian Guard offers is not specifically about Rome. It is about the problem no civilization has definitively solved: how to protect yourself from those you arm to protect you. Augustus's answer created 3 centuries of stability and 3 centuries of terror. Constantine's answer was to demolish the walls and disperse the men, but it was at its core provisional, because the problem it resolved was not institutional, it was human,